Welcome to the latest installment of the American Legislative Exchange Council's States 250 video series. I'm Lee Schalk with ALEC, and I'm joined today by a special guest, Dr. Matthew Spalding. Dr. Spalding is a professor in constitutional government and dean of Hillsdale College's graduate school in Washington, D.C. You were appointed executive director of President Trump's 1776 Commission, which produced the 1776 report. And you are currently a senior academic advisor for America 250 projects. Additionally, your latest book is called The Making of the American Mind, the story of our Declaration of Independence. This is a recovery of the deep roots of the Declaration through a clause-by-clause commentary. Now, Dr. Spalding, did I get all that right? What did I miss?
No, it's a mouthful. So yes, that's fine.
Well, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
And what we wanted to do today in this conversation is we wanted to explore those intellectual roots of the United States Declaration of Independence, the principles that shaped America's founding, such as limited government and federalism, something that we talk a lot about here at ALEC, and how citizens and state leaders today can better understand and preserve those ideals for our future. So a little bit of a look back at history, look at the present, but also looking forward to the next 250 years in America. So, Dr. Spalding, just to kick us off here, tell us a little bit more about your background and your new book.
Yeah, well, first of all, it's great to be here. I've known ALEC for many years and have great respect for the work and in general work for state legislators. I think that the importance of state legislators is under-realized in American politics, how influential and important they are. We can come back to that point. I'm a historian. I'm an academic. I was actually in middle school in 1976 for the bicentennial, which kind of sparked my original interest in history.
Yeah.
But I always loved politics and history and the combination of those things. I was at the Heritage Foundation for a long time, working for Ed Meese, doing this kind of work there. And now I'm at Hillsdale College. I've been there for quite some time, and I teach this. And so my larger project, if you will, if we can call it a project, is to try to recover in our politics a grounding in those principles of the founding. You know, we oftentimes take things for granted. We think of the Declaration. Perhaps on occasion, we think of it and see it in ads for mattresses and used cars, whatever it might be.
Sure.
But I think sometimes it's good to recover and remember and relearn those deeper principles that are rooted in us. Because what is unusual about America as a country, as a constitutional republic, and the way it's structured, is how much of our current politics necessarily points back to our beginnings, how important the beginning is here, because it's those principles that are laid down, it's the principles that give rise to the constitutional framework, it's those principles in the framework that give rise to the combination of a federal government and state governments, and all those things kind of grow out of that. So we need to recover the core fundamentals, and the fundamentals are the Declaration at its primary, because Jefferson brilliantly, he's a wonderful writer, but it's a work of a Continental Congress, not just one person. It's a Continental Congress of all the colonies and states making this statement. And it's a beautiful condensation of all those ideas in one place. The title of the book, The Making of the American Mind, actually comes from a letter that Jefferson wrote later, where he refers to the Declaration as an expression of the American mind, which not something he just made up or pulled out of thin air, but he encapsulated what the American mind, what the common understanding, what the general consensus was at that moment, which was the founding moment that gave rise to everything else in the structure of American government, but also everything else we enjoy today really arises out of that.
Yeah, that's amazing. And I know you went line by line in this book. So when you talk about those influences, this is not just one individual, it's a group. So what were those influences for the signers? What were they thinking at the time?
Yeah, no, I think that's...
And I know that's a huge question, right? You wrote a whole book about it.
No, it is, but well, first of all, let's just pause for a minute to think about why that's important. Today, a lot of these questions about civics and history are debated. And there's a large opinion that none of this matters. All this history really doesn't matter. All it is a current debate. But the history does matter. The founders, the Declaration, the kind of the world, that world in which that was written, which is really the American world, if you will, until actually somewhat recently, was that what history was the decisions, the mistakes, the triumphs of the human beings, especially political figures who are making these decisions. And thus, the course of human events, which is the opening of the Declaration, is a reference to history understood in that way. It's not some sort of grand arc that somehow we accommodate to. If you have conversations today and someone says, "Oh, you're on the wrong side of history," as if somehow there's something out there that we're aligning ourselves to.
Yeah.
Their sense of history was this is what people decide, think, deliberate about, and act on to try to shape history. Well, that's how they understood themselves, but a large component of that was the history that then they inherited, which in turn is our inheritance. So in the book, I spend a lot of time talking about these deeper influences, really going back quite far. I mean, the Greeks and the Romans were very influential. If you studied law, which many of them did, or studied Latin, which anyone that went to college at the time did, you read Cicero. Cicero, the Roman, was the Stoic Roman thinker was very important. The whole Christian tradition is extremely important.
Right.
We have a strong understanding of religious liberty. So I'm not talking about a formal sense of religion. I'm talking about it in the sense of the broad kind of theological horizons of Christianity in particular. You really can't get to human equality without somehow an understanding of equality in the eyes of God. So all of those things have to be understood to come into this.
Sure.
One of the weaknesses, if you think of something like the Declaration as merely a creation of an opinion that happened to be in 1776, we can kind of downplay its importance. Oh, that was just some quirky 18th century idea, which is kind of what the mainstream oftentimes thinks. But in reality, the Declaration is a culmination of thousands of years, the development of the rule of law, especially through British constitutionalism, of the importance of legislatures, developing into consent in the American founding. So that whole picture, especially if you want to think about it, how should we understand these questions today? It's very important to understand that history, if you will.
Yeah, that is fascinating and critically important for all Americans right now in this moment. When you talk about the founders, shifting gears a little bit, I mean, what were some of the lessons that you gleaned from researching this book, learning about their lives and their influences? I mean, are there lessons that we could apply to our lives today as American citizens?
Right. No, there are. There are lots of lessons, in my opinion. I would say a couple of things. One about the thing itself, which teaches us something about what they were up to, which I think actually is very interesting, especially for an ALEC audience, people who are lawmakers. The Continental Congress was a Congress of all the colonies, which say they were lawmakers, they were legislators. The Declaration of Independence is a piece of legislation passed by a Congress. And then when you look at the Declaration, we know the famous parts, right? Everybody kind of can recite.
Yeah, of course.
We hold these truths to be self-evident. But the largest section of the Declaration is about the grievances.
Right.
What were their complaints? And you really can't understand those or know those unless you have a sense of what was going on in the 1770s, 1760s, before that. Which is to say, it's a piece of law. It's legislative. And if you look at the Declaration, it is actually a piece of legislation. It has a beautiful statement of principles, which is the famous part we know of. But really, it's a whereas clause. Here are the principles. Here are the grievances. Here's the conclusion. Therefore, it really is a piece of law. And so there is this long and powerful tradition in the Americans of that legislative tradition, which is very important.
And it was 27 grievances
Yes.
in total? We've had some folks on our policy team sort of dive into each of those.
Right.
So we're kind of in that process as well, doing a little bit of a series there. And you sort of, the next question I had for you, I think you touched on it a little bit, but, could you talk a little bit more about some of the ideals that we espouse here at ALEC? Limited government, free markets, federalism, that shaped our nation.
Right. Well, again, going back to this general point I've been making, I think we have a tendency to look at the Declaration and think of that moment as merely an idealistic statement of principles, and it's a beautiful statement of principles that is for sure. But the way the Declaration operates, and again, look at it. And I would encourage your members, look at it as a piece of legislation. Just look at it and look through the whole thing. It states the principles. All men are created equal. They're endowed by the Creator with certain number of rights, life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. Government is based on consent. If government does secure these rights, people have a right to alter or abolish it. And student, okay. But those are abstractions. They're beautiful. They're principles.
Mm-hmm.
But what do you do in a particular circumstance? And there, I think I'll emphasize again this. It's a way of thinking about politics, which is, I think, the proper way of thinking about politics, which goes back to the Greeks and the Romans and the Christian tradition. It's a prudential way of thinking about politics. As you have a clear stated principle, all men are created equal. Well, what does that mean in particular? What does it mean in practice? Or what does it mean in legislative form? When you get down to the details, how do you actually put it into law? And that lesson of the Declaration, I think, is very very important to that whole period and understanding it. But also, that's how it teaches us to think about politics. Right? Remember, it's in the middle of the Declaration, after the statement of principles, it says prudence will dictate what to do in the circumstances. A long train of abuses, all these grievances.
Right.
So there's a certain logic to the law that I think we have to understand. And then more specifically, the concept of constitutional government, which we all could generally call limited government, or another way of looking at it from the almost the individual's point of view, self-government, right? These representative, whatever combination of words we might use. Where does that come from? And too often we think of those things are merely it's a quirk or a tradition of our history that government's limited. But one thing they were very clear about is that you can't actually limit government unless you have an operating principle informing the limit.
Okay.
Which is to say that unless we understand ourselves to be equal in some fundamental philosophical mooring sense of the word, right? You're not born a king, I'm not born a slave or a serf or a subject. Unless you start with that point, what limits government? Because unless there's some fundamental philosophical grounding of it, it's just a coincidence of history. And it just so happens that we didn't like the king because he was doing all these nasty things to us, but we actually replace it with a different way of thinking about things, which is that government is limited, and the only way you achieve liberty is keeping it limited. But you can only limit government, you can only establish the grounds for liberty if you have a philosophical grounding underneath it. Which is why I always teach when I talk to legislators, I always talk about you need the Declaration and the Constitution. You got to have both, two sides of the same coin. You can't have one without the other. Because what limits government ultimately is the sovereignty question. And the sovereignty question is in the Declaration. We are sovereign. No government is sovereign. The federal government is not sovereign. States are not sovereign. The local dog catcher is not sovereign, right?
That's right.
No government is sovereign. The people are sovereign. And that ultimately is what actually limits government. If government is not sovereign, it only has the powers that are delegated to it. And that's where that whole argument rises out.
Well, I think that's a really important look back at the thought behind those arguments. Now, fast forwarding to where we are today, you touched on, these are really important truths for state legislators to understand, any, member of Congress or lawmaker. So what can we do today beyond a conversation like this to help instill or bring back those core principles and that core understanding?
Yeah, that's right.
Again, I'm asking these.
Right.
These are really big questions.
Well,
but
I will tell you one thing that becomes very clear, and I think we kind of know this, but it's a good to reemphasize it. For the founders, this concept, these principles, constitutional government, all the things we're talking about, they understood very clearly that in all governments, but especially in republics in which we govern ourselves,
Mhm.
it's imperative that citizens know these things. That is, education actually is a component of, sometimes we use this phrase civic education.
Sure.
And sometimes it can get kind of like, oh, that's kind of not that really that interesting. Um, but when you put it in the right context, it's extremely important. It's very interesting. It's crucial because if the citizenry is not educated to understand principles of free government, it's not going to last. And the founders knew about that, and they wrote about this at great length. If you translate that into current day, one thing, all of my work, I'm here in Washington D.C. I'm an advisor to the administration on America 250. I do all these things, but the crucial question of education is not a federal question. Never has been. It is not now. There's no authority in the Constitution for that to be. The key players in the most important educational aspects of American government are state legislators. Governors and legislators, state legislators, are the ones that can control curriculum and education in the K through 12 public schools, which is the backbone of where civic education, where people learn what it means to be a free individual, a self-governing individual, a citizen of the republic. So I think that this just underscores all of that and makes it all the more important. The real curricular debates that we have in America are at that. That's where they are. That's the heart of the matter. And legislators, state legislators, should understand that's, in my opinion, one of the most important powers they have. Despite all the other things that have happened and the changes over time about the relationship between state and federal, undisputed, state legislators, through their legislation and then working with the governor, control curriculum, educational curriculum, and that's really the heart of the matter.
And that feeds right into the work that we're doing here at ALEC every day with our members across the country. Clearly there's a misunderstanding, I think, for many Americans about that exact concept. But is there another thing that you would point to and say, of all the elements of our founding, here's something that's also very misunderstood by the American people? And then how do we correct for that? Or how can Americans take it upon themselves to better understand?
Yeah, it's. I'd probably make a broader observation generally, which is,
Sure.
More and more over time, largely because of a lot of the history, especially the post, World War II, New Deal era, and then really kind of accelerating, is a lot of people think that politics and government occurs at the national level.
Right.
And part of that is, as more and more questions are nationalized, that is misleading. There are extremely important national questions. You think of national security, for instance, that are appropriately nationalized. But many more and more things have been nationalized that weren't intended to be nationalized. And so the sense that some of that's where all politics occurs. If we're going to kind of save limited government, the kind of the cause of the American Revolution, ultimately, it's going to be because we restore that balance in some way. How to actually do it and where to push and where to challenge. Those are kind of prudential questions that are beyond my ken and what you guys are thinking about. But having said that, the importance of reinstilling legislatures in general, Congress, in my opinion, is largely punted on its legislative function vis-a-vis the modern executive. That's a problem. But as important is restoring the importance of state legislators, generally speaking. The role of states in shaping all sorts of policies, education, in my mind, being key, but really everything that is of local concern is centrally important to the whole exercise. The American Revolution was against anything. It was against arbitrary rule from one central location, whether it's George III or whatever it might be. The history of the colonies, the history of the states, the history of the Continental Congress is all what? The main claim was we Americans think that our legislatures should have the role in governing ourselves, which at the time especially meant taxation.
Mm-hmm.
And we are not to be ruled by a king or an arbitrary ruler thousands of miles away, for which we have no say. There's an interesting parallel between that and the modern administrative state and what's going on in our world.
That's right.
And state legislatures, state governors just play, in my mind, the crucial role. How we get there, you guys will figure that out. But in general, I think legislatures in general have to be more aggressive, if you will, in passing laws that we then have to learn how to respect and live by.
And as you take this message around the country, I know that you're a sought-after speaker on this topic and your book has been widely read. What gives you optimism about the future of the country as you share this information, as you have conversations with people, or even as you advise America's leaders?
Yeah. I would probably say a couple of things. One is, we've complained about, we generally corporately have always complained about, so many students aren't learning what they're taught in schools anymore. Part of that means they're actually not hearing the story, oddly enough, right?
Right.
And so I think that there's an opportunity here in this anniversary year to tell the story again. It's a great story. It's a dynamic, interesting, lively story about the American founding. I think it's also the case that the American founding ultimately, as is all politics generally, is something about human nature and whether we are capable of governing ourselves. It's always been the same question, whether it was the American Revolution or the Civil War or the debates today, for that matter. And the question there is, what's the instinct in human nature? And I actually think that the American founders understood it correctly, which is not to say they made it up, it's just because it's theirs, but they understood something true about what it means to be human. And the Declaration really is designed around that, which gives rise to free government. If that's true, I think it is, it was true in 1776, it's also true today, which is that people generally don't like to be ruled. They like to govern themselves.
Right.
They like to have the freedom to raise their families and have their religious liberty and live their lives largely without government. Government is not the end, if you will. And that's really the world that the founders kind of created and laid out for our future to aspire to. I think that's still true, and I think for a lot of people that's a powerful argument in its favor. And I think there's an opportunity to recover that because it's unlike many of the more problematic arguments we're hearing in our culture and in academics about all sorts of, in many ways, oddities, if you will, which really read history backwards in all sorts of strange ways. The argument of the American founding is very much coherent and in line with, I think, the way the average person actually lives their lives. Which is, there are certain fundamental principles. There are just clear and obvious and self-evident ways in which we are equal to each other. No one is born a king. No one is born a slave. We had a great war over that very question. And so I think there's something that that we will go back to, and because it's kind of deep in our DNA, if you will, in a very fundamental way. And so the challenge then is, how do we inspire? How do we spark that interest? How do we kind of get that conversation going in a way? Again, because that's what I want to do in my book.
Well, and I wanted to ask you, if you had to boil it down and there was one piece of advice or something that you could share with the younger generation, you work with college students and graduate students, what would that be when it comes to the founding principles?
One thing I've learned over teaching this for a long time, and I would share that with say legislators, but also teachers and those that are trying to shape.
Well, and that would be my last question: is the message to the state legislators as well? Maybe it's one and the same.
There's a fine line here. it's important to get the argument right, and especially if you're talking about laws and particulars and details and whatnot. But it's so important. I think much more important than in my view I'd thought before. Oftentimes in politics, we think too I was going to say legally. I'm not sure that's right, but we think very kind of precisely and logically. But in reality, the way people learn is not that. People learn by hearing these great stories, by being inspired about them, and by capturing the imagination. So our challenge is, as legislators, as teachers, as people shaping the popular debate, how do you capture the imagination? Because we can overstate the problem.
Sure.
And something that misses the opportunity to enter the conversation, which is, take my case. I was there in 1976. I saw the tall ships. The train came through and their parades. It wasn't a sophisticated, detailed argument about what exactly were the debates with the British government over the nature of consent according to political theory. Right? That all comes later. Civic education, first and foremost, should be about capturing and telling the story. Much of the debates we have today about history fails, in my mind, because it doesn't tell the story. All it wants to focus on what is the current debate, what are the problems, what are the flaws, because we're fighting about those things, and we want to fight about this over here. Let's tell the story, because if you tell the story, you'll get people. If you get their hearts, if they fall in love with it because of the beauty of with the noble thing that was being accomplished here, the other stuff will follow. So I think we need to kind of become better at doing that kind of thing, even though we're doing it through these particular ways that are teaching or legislating or where it might be. And 2026 is the moment we have in which we'll have their attention. So that's the moment to do it.
That's right. Well, I think that's a great place to leave it. I think this has been an amazing conversation. Thank you so much, Dr. Spalding, for coming
Thanks
in
for having me
and chatting with us. For those watching, where can they find you online or keep tabs on the work that you're doing, your latest commentary?
Well, I'm at Hillsdale College, and hillsdale.edu has a website. You can go to the Washington, D.C. campus. If you're in the Washington area, we do events and talks and all sorts of things going on. My Making of the American Mind is available on Amazon, widely available. And if you're interested in things more generally, I would also suggest hillsdale.edu, our main website, has a lot of free online courses on the founding. We just put one out on colonial America. We're just getting ready to put one out on revolutionary America, but all sorts of other things, constitutionalism, but also Shakespeare and other aspects of our curriculum are all free online, and that's also at hillsdale.edu.
I love it. Well, thank you again so much for joining us. For those watching or listening to this, stay tuned, follow along everything that we're doing here at ALEC. You can go to alec.org/states250, and we'll see you next time.